Victory. For 8 long, brutal years, thousands of American patriots had fought for it. They had bled for it, starved for it, and against all odds, they had achieved it. The chains of empire were broken. A new nation, founded on the ideals of liberty and self-governance, had been forged in the crucible of revolution. But for many of those who had sacrificed everything, the glorious promise of independence had begun to curdle into a bitter, agonizing betrayal. This is the untold story of America's first true national crisis after securing its freedom. A story of desperate farmers, led by a forgotten hero, who rose up not against a king, but against their own fledgling government. This is the story of Shays Rebellion, an armed uprising that exposed the terrifying fragility of the young republic and irrevocably set the stage for the creation of the United States Constitution. Our journey begins in the immediate aftermath of the Revolutionary War, circa 1883. The cheers of victory had faded, replaced by the harsh realities of peacetime. Thousands of soldiers, many having left farms and trades years ago, returned home with little more than the clothes on their backs. Their promised pay often evaporated into worthless continental currency, or simply never materialized. The new nation operated under the Articles of Confederation. While revolutionary in its emphasis on state sovereignty, it created a central government with virtually no power. It couldn't tax, couldn't raise an army, and couldn't regulate interstate commerce. Each state was largely a law unto itself, creating a chaotic patchwork of economic policies. Nowhere were these weaknesses more acutely felt than in rural Massachusetts, particularly in its western counties like Hampshire and Berkshire. These were communities predominantly made up of subsistence farmers, many of whom had served bravely in the war. They had fought to escape a distant, oppressive government, only to find themselves crushed by a closer, seemingly equally indifferent one. The Massachusetts state government, dominated by wealthy merchants and creditors from eastern cities like Boston, adopted a harsh fiscal policy. They sought to rapidly pay off war debts through aggressive taxation and specie payments, meaning gold and silver, not paper money. For the struggling farmers, this was a death blow. They had no hard currency. Their wealth was in their land, their crops, and their labor. As taxes mounted, and with creditors demanding payment in scarce coin, the farmers quickly sank into inescapable debt. The legal consequences were swift and brutal: foreclosures, property seizures, and perhaps most terrifying, debtor's prison. Imagine fighting for freedom, only to be thrown into jail for owing a few shillings. This was the reality for thousands. The very ideals of the revolution, no taxation without representation, the right to property, the pursuit of happiness, seemed hollow, a cruel mockery for those who had sacrificed so much. A deep, simmering resentment began to boil. The seeds of rebellion were being sown. The injustice was palpable. But before resorting to arms, the desperate farmers of western Massachusetts exhausted every legal and political avenue available to them. This was not a spontaneous, lawless uprising. It was a movement born of repeated, ignored pleas for redress. Throughout 1786, town meetings across the western counties became forums for passionate debate and collective action. Thousands signed petitions detailing their grievances and begging the state legislature for relief. Their demands were simple, yet profound: the issuance of paper money to ease the specie shortage, a moratorium on debts, and a reduction in exorbitant court fees. They called for an end to the tyranny of the lawyers and merchants. But the state legislature, meeting far away in Boston, remained deaf to their cries. Influenced by wealthy creditors and conservative voices, they dismissed the petitions as the complaints of lazy debtors who sought to avoid their lawful obligations. Prominent figures like Samuel Adams, once a champion of popular protest against British rule, now declared that rebellion against a republic is rebellion indeed. The government's intransigence, its refusal to even acknowledge the legitimacy of their suffering, drove the farmers to a desperate conclusion. Their voices would not be heard through legal channels. If the legal system was being used to dispossess them, they would shut down the legal system itself. The target became the county courts, the very engines of foreclosure and imprisonment for debt. Beginning in August 1786, bands of armed citizens, often veterans in their old Continental uniforms, began to gather. Their purpose, to prevent the courts from sitting, thereby halting the legal process that threatened their livelihoods. These initial actions were often orderly, even ritualistic. The regulators, as they called themselves, would march to the courthouse, demand that the judges adjourn without conducting business, and then disperse. It was a direct echo of the Stamp Act protests against the British, where colonial courts were similarly shut down. Among those who took up arms was a quiet, respected farmer from Pelham, emphasis strong, Daniel Shays. Shays was no radical firebrand. He was a decorated Revolutionary War captain, having fought at Lexington, Bunker Hill, and Saratoga. He had resigned from the army, penniless, his own pay unpaid, only to return to a struggling farm and mounting debts. He understood the farmer's plight firsthand. Initially reluctant, he was eventually persuaded to lead these desperate men. His name would become synonymous with the rebellion itself. By the autumn of 1786, the movement had escalated. Shays and his Shaysites effectively shut down courts in Northampton, Worcester, and Springfield. The state government, having no national army to call upon and struggling to raise its own militia, found itself paralyzed. The rule of law, the very foundation of the new republic, was being actively challenged. The stakes were rising, and the fragile American experiment was teetering on the brink. As 1786 drew to a close, the standoff in Massachusetts deepened. The state government, desperate to reassert its authority, declared the Shaysites in a state of rebellion. But without the power to raise a federal army, or even effectively fund its own state militia, it faced an existential crisis. The very weakness of the Articles of Confederation was now threatening to unravel the republic from within. Wealthy merchants in Boston, recognizing the dire threat to their property and the economic order, stepped in to privately finance a state army. Led by General Benjamin Lincoln, a distinguished Revolutionary War officer, this force was quickly assembled to crush the rebellion. Meanwhile, Daniel Shays and his growing contingent of regulators had a crucial target in mind: the federal arsenal at Springfield. The Springfield arsenal was a strategic prize. It housed thousands of muskets, cannons, and vast stores of gunpowder. To the Shaysites, securing these arms meant the power to truly challenge the state's authority and defend their rights. To the government, its capture meant anarchy. On January 25, 1787, Shays led approximately 1,200 men toward the arsenal, hoping to seize it before General Lincoln's army could arrive. However, General William Shepherd, commanding a smaller state militia, was already defending the arsenal. As Shays' men advanced, snow crunching underfoot, Shepherd's troops fired 2 warning shots. When the regulators continued their advance, Shepherd ordered a volley of cannon fire. The grape shot tore through the ranks of the Shaysites. 4 men were killed instantly, 20 wounded. It was a bloody, decisive moment. The inexperienced, poorly organized rebels broke and fled in disarray. The attack on the Springfield arsenal was a catastrophic failure. General Lincoln's main army arrived just days later, pursuing the retreating Shaysites relentlessly through the bitter cold of winter. A final, desperate clash at Petersham in early February scattered the remaining rebels, effectively ending the organized rebellion. Daniel Shays and many of his followers fled to neighboring states. The rebellion had been crushed. In the aftermath, the Massachusetts government took harsh measures. Hundreds of regulators were arrested, some charged with treason and sentenced to death, though most were eventually pardoned. Daniel Shays himself was condemned to death in absentia, though he too would later receive a pardon. The immediate crisis had passed, but the profound questions raised by Shays' Rebellion would echo far beyond the battlefields of Massachusetts. For many of the nation's most influential leaders, the rebellion served as a terrifying validation of their worst fears. If a state could not even control an internal uprising, if armed citizens could shut down courts at will, then the American experiment in self-government was doomed. The chaos in Massachusetts was a blazing siren call for a stronger, more centralized federal government. The stage was now set for the most critical political gathering in American history. The echoes of Shays' Rebellion reverberated throughout the nascent United States. For figures like George Washington, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton, the uprising was a stark, undeniable proof of the urgent need to scrap the Articles of Confederation and create a fundamentally new framework for government. The crisis in Massachusetts was the ultimate impetus for the Constitutional Convention. In May 1787, just months after the last shots of Shays' Rebellion were fired, delegates from 12 states gathered in Philadelphia. Their mandate was to revise the Articles of Confederation, but the consensus quickly shifted. A wholly new document was necessary. The spirit of Shays' Rebellion, the fear of both anarchy and excessive centralized power, pervaded their deliberations. The core challenge was to strike a delicate balance, create a government strong enough to maintain order, regulate commerce, and enforce laws, but not so strong as to become tyrannical. The lessons of Shays' Rebellion directly influenced key provisions of the new Constitution. It granted Congress the power to levy taxes, to regulate interstate commerce, and critically, to raise and support armies to suppress insurrections and repel invasions. It also empowered the federal government to ensure a republican form of government in each state, providing a safeguard against future internal revolts. Though Daniel Shays and his desperate farmers were often portrayed as lawless rebels, their actions, however violent, forced a profound reckoning among the nation's founders. The rebellion underscored the critical need for a government that could respond to the economic grievances of its citizens and maintain a stable, unified republic. It accelerated the understanding that liberty without order could quickly descend into chaos. By September 17, 1787, the delegates had finished their work. The United States Constitution, a document that would define American governance for centuries, was signed. Its ratification was not immediate or easy, but the specter of Shays' Rebellion loomed large in the minds of many. It was an argument for a stronger union that proved incredibly powerful. In the end, Daniel Shays faded into obscurity, dying a poor farmer in New York. But his desperate uprising, born of economic despair and perceived injustice, achieved a paradoxical triumph. While the rebellion itself failed, it succeeded in revealing the fundamental flaws in the Articles of Confederation. It served as a powerful, undeniable catalyst, a final, dramatic push that led directly to the Constitutional Convention. Shays' Rebellion reminds us that the American experiment was never finished, never perfect. It was and remains a constant negotiation between liberty and order, state power and individual rights. The shouts of those desperate farmers, silenced by cannon fire, echo through the very foundations of the Constitution, a testament to the enduring struggle to create a more perfect union.